Heavenly Father, thank you that you speak to us and that you created the world and us. As you come to your word, help us to understand it rightly and help us think about whether Jesus is compatible with science. Amen. So we're going to be reading today from Luke. Luke chapter 5, verses 17 to 25. So read along with the screen. If you have a Bible, you can read along there as well. So one day, Jesus was teaching, and the Pharisees and teachers of the law were sitting there. They had come from every village of Galilee and from Judea and Jerusalem. And the power of the Lord was with Jesus to heal the sick. Some men came carrying a paralyzed man on a mat and tried to take him into the house to lay him before Jesus. When they could not find a way to do this because of the crowd, they went up on the roof and lowered him on his mat through the tiles into the middle of the crowd, right in front of Jesus. When Jesus saw their faith, he said, "Friend, your sins are forgiven." The Pharisees and teachers of the law began thinking to themselves, "Who is this fellow who speaks blasphemy? Who can forgive sins but God alone?" Jesus knew what they were thinking and asked, "Why are you thinking these things in your hearts? Which is easier to say, 'Your sins are forgiven,' or say, 'Get up and walk'? But I want you to know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins." So he said to the paralyzed man, "I tell you, get up, take your mat and go home." Immediately he stood up in front of them, took what he had been lying on, and went home praising God. Everyone was amazed and gave praise to God. They were filled with awe and said, "We have seen remarkable things today."
Good afternoon, and thanks for coming along today as we think about the topic of Jesus and science and whether Jesus is compatible with science. My name is James Mittelstadt, and I would like to refer myself as the Pokemon collector of university degrees. I currently have 4 bachelor degrees, and I think I'm going to cap it there. And the reason I'm telling you that is not so you can marvel at my academic prowess, but because one of those degrees is a science degree, and the other degree is a theological degree. And they're 2 things which many people may think are incompatible in today's world. In fact, earlier we just had read out for us a section from Luke's biography of Jesus' life. And in chapter 5, which we just had read out for us earlier, there's some very strange and confronting things. In fact, it's not just strange. I want to suggest to you that for many of us today, the things that we just heard about a paralysed man being healed are downright offensive. We just heard about this paraplegic guy who can't walk, and he gets carried by his mates onto the roof of a house, and they somehow dismantle it, do a bit of a renovation rescue thing, and they winch him through the roof so he lands on the floor at Jesus' feet. And this Rabbi Jesus tells a paraplegic guy who hasn't walked in years, who would have had muscular atrophy, to just get up and to go home. And you've got to ask the question, are you serious, Jimbo? Isn't this just superstitious nonsense in our scientific age? We hear it all the time, don't we now, with the history of science and religion. Finally, we've been freed from the oppressive dark ages in the past, and the poster boys of new atheism have finally buried religious faith once and for all with a mighty shovel of science. Now let's look at what Richard Dawkins has to say. He says, "As a scientist, I am hostile to fundamentalist religion because it actively debauches the scientific enterprise. It teaches us not to change our minds and not to want to know exciting things that are available to be known. It subverts science and saps the intellect." Or what about Sam Harris? He says, "Given that faith is generally nothing more than permission religious people give one another to believe things strongly without evidence, a conflict between science and religion is unavoidable." What about the late Christopher Hitchens? He says, "Today, the least educated of my children knows much more about the natural order than any of the founders of religion. All attempts to reconcile faith with science and reason are consigned to failure and ridicule for precisely these reasons." These are big claims that scientists make. Claims that if Christianity cannot answer, will either marginalise what Christians have to say, or even worse, make Christians out to be liars. in fact, an evil force in this world that needs to be stopped or silenced. It's my hope today, and I want to suggest to you that perhaps the claims that are being made by the marketing department of the New Atheists aren't as sturdy and solid as they seem. That maybe it's not actually so easy to dismiss the claims that Jesus makes. And so to do that, we're going to look at this issue from a number of different perspectives. Okay, so firstly, we're going to look at how the battle between science and religion have been played out historically. Okay, secondly, we're going to then look at the philosophical claims that science makes. That is, what is science claiming to tell us about the world, and how does that compare with what the Bible is claiming to tell us? And so we'll start with these two meta questions about the history of science and religion, and the philosophy of science and religion. And then we'll look at how that applies to the specific case example of miracles, and we'll look at how that applies to that story we heard from Luke chapter 5 earlier. Now, apologies, if you're really interested in evolution, there's too much to cover in today's talk, so we've actually put on other opportunities where you can come along and ask some questions to a panel of scientists, including a number of lecturers here at the university. And so I'll tell you more about that at the end. Okay. But let's begin first of all with a story. Okay, everyone loves a good story. Okay, once upon a time, the world lived in darkness. And people were pretty happy, but that's because people were pretty stupid back then. And because they were ignorant and uneducated, big, powerful institutions like the big bad the big bad church, they went around oppressing people and discouraging them from exciting things like science. Because who knows what would happen if people discovered science? They may even begin to think for themselves. And who knows what would happen if people began to think for themselves? They may even begin to overthrow the power of the church, and that would be terrible. And so in those times, one man rose up. One man stood against them all. One man rose up to save humanity, the man Galileo Galilei. Galileo was an Italian physicist, a mathematician, an engineer, an astronomer, and he wasn't a Ninja Turtle, unfortunately. And he lived during the Renaissance. And because of his huge contribution to scientific knowledge and scientific method, he is actually known as the father of modern science. And most people know that he is the one who invented the telescope. He is the one who actually showed us that the ancient understandings of the universe were wrong. And in fact, Copernicus was right in stating that the sun was at the center of the universe. And just as famous as his scientific discoveries are his legendary clashes with the Catholic Church, who labelled him at the time a heretic. Many popular descriptions of Galileo depict him as this man who stood up against the church in a time of ignorance and who was persecuted because of his beliefs. However, I want to suggest to you that that is a gross and simplistic overstatement of what actually happened. You see, in reality, Galileo was actually a friend of the Pope at the time, and his ideas were actually accepted by many of the clergy of his day. And while religion did in fact play a role in his early demise, recent rereadings of the primary historical documents, if you go back and actually look at the original letters that were written backwards and forwards at the day, the actual evidence indicates that his persecution was due more to the way that he presented his theories than to the actual content of the theories themselves. You see, the way that he presented his theories was by writing a story. We all like stories. And so he made two fictitious characters. One of them represented himself, and the other one, who he basically called Simpleton, represented the Pope. And he actually put the Pope's words in the mouth of this guy called Simpleton. And so even if his theories were correct, the way that he was proposing them by using satire and ridiculing the Pope was never going to gain him any favours. You see, Galileo had an abrasive personality, a bit like Kevin Rudd's. So even if he did have some good ideas, they got cut down not because of their validity, but because of his abrasive personality. But over time, the stories of these battles between science and religion, and this is not the only example, they often get reshaped to take on a powerful, overarching story that goes throughout history that claims that science and religion have always been in conflict. That science is always progressive, and that religion is always oppressive. Now, I don't want to claim for a minute that religious people, people claiming to be Christians, haven't done things against science that should not have been done. There have genuinely been instances, sadly, of conflict between the two. but overwhelmingly, on the whole, it is Christians who have fostered science and who have encouraged study of the universe precisely because of their belief in a God of order. But ever since the rise of modernity, people have begun to reshape the stories of the past to create a powerful reinterpretation of history. And they use that in order to oppose religion and to offer science as a better way forward. In fact, as the way forward. But you see, this assumes many things. It assumes that science is a superior way to know things. In fact, that science is the only way to know stuff. And that leads us to our second question, which is, how is it that we actually know stuff in this world? One of the big problems with science and religion is their claim about what humans are able to know and how it is that we know stuff in this world. This is the study of what people like to call epistemology, which is not about engineers getting drunk and urinating on the sidewalk. It's the study of how do we actually know things. So what I want you to do is to turn to the person next to you and in 1 minute try to brainstorm all the possible different ways that you can know about stuff. Okay, you've got 1 minute, and time starts now.
Let's not argue.
Let's not
Let's hear, what are some of the different ways that you guys can know stuff in this world?
Reading textbooks.
Reading textbooks. Okay, yeah, reading textbooks. Hopefully you guys are still doing that. Experience, your experience of life.
So perception and reasoning.
Perception and then logic, using our logic to deduce things from that, yep.
Someone told me.
Someone told me, yep.
Experiment.
Experiments. Oh, Kristen's a science student, she loves experiments. And so there's lots of different ways we can know stuff, but in science, the way you know stuff is pretty simple. And I hope you'll remember it from your high school science lessons, particularly you art students. Basically, you start off with what's known as an observation. Okay, your observation may be something as simple like, the grass is tall and it's been raining a lot over the last few weeks. You then go away and you make a hypothesis. Your hypothesis might be something like, rain causes grass to grow. That seems pretty basic. Then you go out and you test your hypothesis. And so you go out and you measure the rate of grass growing when it has been raining, and you compare the rate of grass growth when it hasn't been raining. Okay? Based on that, you get some results, and they show you that grass grows 5 centimetres per week when it didn't rain, and maybe 15 centimetres per week when it did rain. Based on that result, you then go away and you make a conclusion. It could be that grass grows 3 times quicker with rain than when it doesn't rain. Okay? Observation, hypothesis, test, results, and conclusion or modification of your original hypothesis. Okay, that's the scientific method. We all kind of get ingrained with it in high school. But do you notice what the scientific method assumes? The scientific method assumes a number of important things. Firstly, it assumes that things in nature operate under consistent laws. It assumes that things in life are not random. It assumes that if I throw an apple up in the air, that the apple will always fall back down. You see, if an apple stayed up in the air one time, and then the next time I threw it up in the air and it flew around in circles, and the next time it just took off into outer space, then the laws of gravity would not be consistent. And science can describe how it's consistent, but cannot describe why it's consistent. Why can't objects behave however they want? Secondly, though, the second scientific method assumes that you can subject something to an experiment to work out how it will behave. That is, science relies on what we call replication or repeatability. And so if I do an experiment to see how quickly the grass grows, science demands that someone else on the other part of the world, using the same set of circumstances and controlling for all the same factors, should be able to get exactly the same set of results. And if they don't, then either my initial hypothesis was wrong, or maybe they did the experiment incorrectly. Thirdly, though, science assumes that we can create true conclusions based on our data. Science assumes that we have all the information we need to make a valid conclusion. But take our grass growing analogy, for example. What if there's another factor I haven't taken into consideration? Maybe when it rains more, people go and throw fertiliser out in the grass more so it kind of absorbs into the ground. And so maybe it's the fertiliser that's causing the grass to grow and not the rain itself. Okay? All science can do is describe associations between two different events. It can give you really good probable theories about how those two events are related, but it cannot give you a definitive explanation or conclusion because science cannot claim to have perfect knowledge of the entire system always. So how do these limits to the scientific method impact our debate about the existence of God and the truthfulness of the Bible? Well, I want to say to you that firstly, it is the Christian God who provides a basis for modern science and the expectation that we have of consistency in the natural world. You see, in the ancient world, the Roman and the Greek gods were petty and cruel. They used to fight with each other, and you never know who was going to win, Zeus or someone else. And so you couldn't wake up and know whether the rain was going to come or whether the sun would shine because the gods were always fighting with each other. There was no predictability about how the natural world would act. Things were just random. But the God of the Bible is a God of order and not disorder. Because in the Bible's worldview, there is only one true God. He's not petty, he's not vindictive, he's not having little conflicts with other gods in this world. And so he is consistent and he's in complete control, and therefore we can expect that his creation will be consistent as well. We can expect that it's going to act in predictable ways. And so therefore, rather than science being opposed to Christianity, science actually arose out of a Christian understanding of the world based on the Bible. Secondly, though, the claims of the Bible are largely untestable by modern scientific inquiry because we cannot repeat the events of the Bible. Okay, we'll have questions at the end, so we want to hold on to them, we'll ask at the end. The claims of the Bible are largely untestable by modern scientific inquiry because you cannot go back in a time machine and observe what happened. Okay? We cannot repeat the passage of the Israelites through the Red Sea. We cannot repeat the crucifixion of Jesus. We cannot even repeat the Big Bang. And so while we can make really, really good assumptions, for the most part, we need to rely on the testimony of witnesses to tell us things. We do this all the time, don't we? We turn on Channel 10 at 5 o'clock and they have Channel 10 Eyewitness News. You don't doubt the credibility of the news just because you didn't go and subject it to an experiment, or just because it has eyewitness in front of it. In fact, most of life we rely on the eyewitness testimony of others to tell us about events that we haven't personally seen with our own eyes. We rely on people to mediate or to pass on information about events that we have no personal experience of. Thirdly, though, we need to be aware of accepting the deductions that science makes on the basis of its data. We cannot exclude alternative explanations for the results that we have. One good example of this is the reliability of the Bible. For years, academic scholars have been criticising the Gospel of John, John's biography of Jesus' life, because in it, John talks about this thing called the Pool of Siloam in Jerusalem. And as archaeologists had dug up Jerusalem, they had not found any evidence of a Pool of Siloam. And so based on their lack of results, they made the conclusion that therefore John was not an eyewitness who lived in Jesus' time. That he didn't even live in Jerusalem, he must have been writing from somewhere else and had no eyewitness experience of what had been going on. But then in 2004, only kind of 12 years ago, the Israeli Nature and Parks Authority were doing some excavation work to dig up some sewers. And as they did that, they actually uncovered some steps. And as they dug a bit further, they actually uncovered this Pool of Siloam, which until 12 years ago, we had no knowledge of. And so that brings us to a really important principle to remember. And that is the principle that an absence of evidence is not evidence of an absence. That is, just because you don't have evidence for something doesn't mean that it's not true. It may just mean that you don't yet have the information. So just because we don't have evidence for something doesn't mean that it didn't exist. It just means we may not have observed it. And so when we hear of something like miracles, we cannot exclude them just because we personally cannot repeat them, or we personally haven't seen them with our own eyes. It may mean that we haven't seen them because, just like other historical events, they are unique events that are not repeatable. There's also a few other dangers we need to be careful of when talking about how science knows stuff. The first danger we need to be wary of is what's called the reductionistic error. In its quest to understand stuff, science reduces things. It kind of pulls them apart into its basic components. And using that approach, we've learned many important and exciting things. But that has dangers as well. You see, if you reduce your human body into your basic elements, you end up with 6 of the most boring elements on Earth, making up 99.9% of your body. And if you sold those elements on eBay, they would be worth about $5 on the market today. Now, I'm sure if I suggested to you that you are worth $5 as a human, you would be offended. Okay? We sell animals for more than $5. And so, to try and reduce something to its basic components doesn't do justice to the beauty and the complexity of when you combine them together and what it means to be truly human. And yet science does this all the time. And we hear it in our modern thinking, in our modern society. Around the time most of you guys were born, and you guys were running around in diapers, I was in high school, and there was this band called the Bloodhound Gang. And they put out this song and it had the line, "You and me, baby, ain't nothing but mammals, so let's do it like they do on the Discovery Channel." You see, according to science, if we are just animals, if we can reduce the human race into animal behaviour, then we should just act like animals. But we know that that's not true. We know that there's something more complex and something more beautiful than what it means to be human than just our primal urges. The second thing we need to be aware of is what science calls the naturalistic fallacy. That is, science describes things, but it cannot prescribe things. Science describes things, it cannot prescribe things. It tells you what does happen, it cannot tell you what morally should happen. But science sometimes oversteps that boundary and it implies or even claims that whatever exists, whatever is natural, is good. Now, as a former medical doctor, I saw this all the time. Parents would come in and they would claim how vaccinations are evil and terrible because they're artificial, right? They're not natural. And natural things like bacteria, like pertussis, are good for us. Except they forget the fact that for thousands of years, millions of children have died from natural things like pertussis. And so we see this naturalistic fallacy in all areas of life, that just because something occurs or exists in nature, that therefore it must be good. And one of the clearest articulations of this is seen in our modern poet Lady Gaga's hit, Born This Way. She says, "I'm on the right track, baby, I was born this way." Now, for want of a better word, she actually makes a moral argument that she's on a right moral track because of a natural inclination. Okay? She says that any condition or any urge or any desire that we have as humans, whether it's sexual or whether it's to kill someone or whatever it is, the moral naturalistic fallacy would say that anything you feel is good. And we shouldn't judge that because anything that exists must be morally good. Often science accuses religious people of having blind faith and of being anti-rational. Often faith is described as the famous author Mark Twain put it. He says, "Faith is believing what you know ain't true." But that is not how the Bible describes faith. The word faith in the Bible literally means the word trust. And trust is a normal part of how we do things all the time in life. It's how we know stuff. And you can have your trust in things that are reliable and things that are not reliable. And science, by its very nature, requires evidence-based faith. Trust that is based on the facts and evidence, because you cannot go and you cannot repeat every single science experiment that has ever been done in this world. All the stuff you read in your textbook, you most likely will never have experimented on yourself firsthand. And yet you trust in it all the time. You live with a functional trust in your daily life every day. When you hop on a plane, you trust, you have faith in the airline. You trust that they have maintained their airplane well. You trust that the pilot has been well trained, that the air traffic controller has been given accurate information. And you entrust your entire life, you put your life in their hands. Based on what? Science? Well, yes, it is science, but you yourself haven't gone and tested every little rivet on that plane. You haven't gone and certified the pilot yourself. And yet you live your life, placing your life in their hands based on the evidence of people who you trust. We do it all the time. So let's return to our example of Galileo, who we heard about earlier. Galileo is often held up as this example of the conflict between science and religion. But that conflict was actually due to other problems. You see, the problem was that not that Galileo and the church had this thing because the church was anti-science. The problem was actually that the church was too scientific. And you're probably thinking, what? Like, have you lost the plot, Jimbo? You see, the problem was not that the church was against science. The problem was that they backed the wrong theory. You see, thousands of years earlier, it was actually Aristotle who had proposed the idea that the Earth was the centre of the universe and that the sun went around the Earth. And as the church listened to Aristotle's theory of the universe, they went, well, that seems to match up with what we observe of the universe as well. And so they said, okay, that's what we believe as well. And so the problem was not that they were anti-science, the problem was they believed Aristotle's theory of the universe, and they weren't open to reviewing it in light of the new evidence of Copernicus' theory of the universe. So let's have a read of how historian and scientist Kirsten Burkett describes this. Now, it's a bit of a long quote, but she's pretty good at articulating this issue quite well. She says, "The great Aristotelian synthesis left medieval Christianity irrevocably tied to an ultimately faulty philosophy. By the time the flaws in the philosophy were demonstrated, the upholders of the system, supposed to be Christian, were so steeped in Aristotelianism that they were unable to cope with the changes. The result was that Christianity was discredited for something that was nothing to do with it. The same danger potentially lies before us with theories of modern science, if we're not careful. Modern empirical science is an excellent route to knowledge about our physical universe, and most likely a lot of what it promotes is true. Yet its very success lies in the contingent and revisable nature of its theories. Empirical science is a system which is only ever probably true, and deliberately so, for by nature it must allow itself to be open to constant revision in the light of new evidence. Science advances by rejection of the old and the scrutiny of the new, and that is the strength and real value of scientific knowledge." Scientific knowledge is about us as humans trying to put some object or something under the microscope. And that is great when you're trying to learn about some object. But it's completely inadequate, as we saw earlier with examples of humans, if you want to try and get to know someone. And you could bung me into a CT scanner and you could tell all sorts of things about my kidneys and my liver, and it's really exciting to show you my scans one day if you really want to know. But it's really inadequate to know what I'm like, what kind of things I'm passionate about, what I believe in as a person, what I care about in life. And that's why it's important to recognise that if there is a God in this universe, then it's important not just to know facts about him, to put him in a CT scanner, but to know him relationally. You see, if there is a God, if there is someone who has made you, then it is important for you to know him just like you know your friends and your family. And the message of the Bible is that one man in history, the man Jesus Christ, claims to have actually seen God and be an eyewitness of God, and claims to have been God and to have come among us to reveal and show to us what God is like. And so I want to challenge you, are you spending so much time putting God under the microscope that you forget that he's the one who has you under his microscope? So what about miracles then? Well, how does it all apply to this random bit we heard earlier from the Gospel of Luke, Luke's biography of Jesus' life? And don't miracles break those regular laws we were talking about earlier? And isn't this just the stuff of ancient mythology and flying spaghetti monsters? As we turn our attention to the topic of miracles, it's important for us to think about how we actually define miracles. I think for most people in our society, we define miracles as a violation of the laws of nature. That comes from David Hume, a Scottish philosopher a few hundred years ago. And that is, under his view, the world is all regular and clock-like, right? It's running along normally. And a miracle is when someone comes along and they interfere with the regular running of the universe and play around with the cogs. Now, one of the problems with this view is that it assumes a view of God that is not necessarily consistent with how the Bible actually portrays him. You see, many of us have what's known as a deist view of God. That is, we view God as the cosmic clockmaker. That is, if there is a God, he made the universe like a clock, and he wound it up, he set it going, he put it on the mantelpiece, and he stood back, and he's kicking back on his beanbag, watching some TV or playing Xbox. Okay? And the regularity we see in the universe happens because those cogs just keep ticking along by themselves. And so if we do see a miracle, it's because the clockmaker's got up off his beanbag, he's interfered with the clock, and he's actually messing around with the cogs and how it normally runs. But that is not how the Bible describes the God of the universe. According to the Bible, if the universe is a clock, then every time that second hand is moving, it only happens because the clockmaker is actively moving it. It says in Psalm 147 that God covers the heavens with clouds. He prepares rain for the earth. He makes grass grow on the hills. He gives to the beasts their food and to the young ravens that cry. He gives snow like wool. He scatters frost like ashes. He hurls down his crystals of ice like crumbs. Who can stand before his cold? He sends out his word and melts them. He makes his wind blow and the waters flow. The God of the universe in the Bible is active in the universe at every single moment. And instead of being a cosmic clockmaker, the God of the Bible is more like the cosmic Johnny Ive from Apple. Okay? He's made this world more like an Apple Watch that needs to be charged daily. It cannot last very long on its own. It needs an Apple iPhone to allow it to do stuff and to connect to the internet. It needs regular software updates from its maker, Apple. You see, this is what the God of the universe in the Bible is like, because the universe is not self-sufficient, but it keeps ticking along only because he is actively working second by second to keep it running. And if he chose one day to stop, then the universe as we know would end. And in this biblical view of the universe, miracles are not God intervening and tinkering around with the cogs. Miracles are God just doing something different in the way to which he normally does things in this universe. Well, let's actually go back and look at the commonly accepted definition of a miracle, which we heard earlier from 18th century philosopher David Hume. He says a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature. And as a firm and unalterable experience has established these laws, the proof against a miracle from the very nature of the fact is as entire as any argument from experience as can be imagined. It is no miracle that a man seemingly in good health should die on a sudden, because such a kind of death, although more unusual than any other, has yet been frequently observed to happen. But it is a miracle that a dead man should come to life, because that has never been observed in any age or country. There must therefore be a uniform experience against every miraculous event, otherwise the event would not merit that appellation. Basically, Hume argues that the way we know stuff is, as we said earlier, through our experience. We observe things through observation. And he says miracles, by definition, are things that have never been observed in any time, any place, or any country. Okay? He says there must be a uniform lack of experience of any miracles. As soon as you experience a miracle, then it's no longer a miracle. Otherwise, it's not a miracle, it's just a rare event, like someone dropping dead. And so in the end, Hume's argument against miracles is that we don't experience miracles, therefore miracles don't exist. Which is kind of a bit of a logical, he's kind of painting himself out of a logical argument. And now when people talk about miracles in the Bible, there's often a common objection that people give. The objection often here is that the laws of nature have removed the space for miracles. That is, that as our scientific knowledge increases and expands and we know more stuff, then the shroud of ignorance shrinks, allowing less room or even no room for the miraculous. You see, in the past when we didn't know stuff, when we didn't know how the world works, we could describe rare events like eclipses as miracles. But now, rare events like eclipses are not signs from God, but they're scientifically describable events. But as we saw earlier, it's the Christian God who is actively involved in his universe at every single point. And so, under that kind of view, it's not surprising that the author of the universe can change the way that he does things. In fact, C.S. Lewis, who wrote the Narnia books, he describes it by saying, imagine I put $50 in an envelope in my drawer on a Saturday, and then I pull out that envelope on Sunday and I put another $50 in the envelope. He says the laws of math allow me to predict that when I open that envelope on Monday, there's going to be $100. But what should I conclude if I open the envelope on Monday, there's only $50 in there? Should I conclude that the rules of maths have been broken as a miraculous thing? He says, no, of course not. If you go to your drawer on Monday morning and you only find $50 in there and you're expecting 100, it should make you conclude that some thief has come along and opened up the envelope and taken $50 off you. In fact, he says, furthermore, it would be ludicrous to claim that the laws of arithmetic made it impossible to believe in the existence of such a thief or the possibility of his intervention. On the contrary, it is the normal workings of those laws that have exposed the existence and activity of the thief. That is, it's the regularity, the regular working of God in this world that draws attention to when he chooses to do things in a different way. It's just like if for 364 days of the year I decide to be a really good husband and cook spaghetti bolognese for my wife, because that's about the only thing I can cook well, okay? If I then take her out for dinner, that is not a miracle, although she may say that. What it does is it actually draws attention to the significance of that day. The fact that it's our anniversary, or maybe it's her birthday. And so in the Bible, miracles are not just done as random party tricks. They always have a particular significance, and they show us something particular about God and how he's coming to save us. And so we must remember that what Hume said when he argued against miracles was not that miracles were impossible, because to claim so is logically and intellectually empty. What Hume was claiming was that miracles were very, very, very improbable based on our experience of the world. And so when we think about experiences, we need to make sure we put the miraculous event into the right category. You see, if I asked you how common is it for there to be fireworks on Sydney Harbour, you might say it's pretty rare, 1 in 365, less than 1%. But what if I changed the category and redefined it? What if I asked you how common is it for there to be fireworks on Sydney Harbour on New Year's Eve? Well, in that case, it's almost 100% frequency, isn't it? You see, depending on what category or class you put something in, will determine whether you would think that thing is likely to happen or not. And so if we think about the resurrection of Jesus, if you think that Jesus is just another human like the rest of us, then our experience of resurrection is that most people die and stay dead. But if you put Jesus in the class of the one person who is fully God and fully man, and actually the firstborn of the dead and the Son of God himself, then that is in a category and a class of which we have very little experience. A category and a class in which it may be completely reasonable for people to come back from the dead and to begin a new humanity. Secondly, though, your belief in miracles is also tainted and dependent on what you think the purpose of that miracle is for. You see, if I told you that your friend had quit university and are living in a tree, most of you would think I'm kind of strange. But if you knew that your friend was very passionate about the environment, and if you knew that Malcolm Turnbull had just decided to announce he's going to chop down the Tasmanian rainforest, then you would be expecting your friend to act in ways that are consistent with what you know of them. And in fact, you would be more likely to believe that your friend is living in a tree than some random on the street if I told them. You see, if you know the purpose of an event, then it may not be as strange or as unlikely to other people. And so I want to suggest to you that as you look at the Bible's descriptions of miracles, they're not designed to be party tricks. They're designed to show you something about the fact that Jesus does the things that only God can do. He does the things to show that he is God. And so in the case of the paraplegic man we heard from earlier in Luke chapter 5, this is not just some random miracle, Jesus does a party trick and heals some person. Because 700 years earlier, the prophet Isaiah had spoken about a day when people would see the glory of the Lord, the majesty of our God. He will come and save you. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, the ears of the deaf unstopped, and the lame man shall leap like a deer, and the tongue of the mute sing for joy. Jesus does this miracle of the healing of the paraplegic man to show that he is God. That he is God who is coming to save and to rescue his people. And as this passage shows, Jesus rescues his people by bringing forgiveness. I want to finish up today with a quick warning. That is, that science can often be for us a smokescreen. There's many complex factors that lead a person to believe or disbelief in God. Some are personal experiences, some are intellectual, and some are social. Sociologists of knowledge have shown that our peer group and our primary relationships shape our beliefs much more than we want to admit. And scientists, just like non-scientists, are very affected by the beliefs and attitudes of the people from whom they want to respect. It's easy for us to hide behind science, just like a religious person can hide behind their belief in God. And if the evidence doesn't add up, well then sure, let's chat about the evidence. But at the end of the day, what would be enough proof for you? Are you just using science as an excuse to ignore the claims that Jesus is making about himself in the Bible? You see, the Bible claims that this guy Jesus is not just a human, but he is the one who existed before this entire physical universe that science talks about. And he is the one who made everything we observe in the scientific world. Colossians 1 says that Jesus is the image of the invisible God. In Jesus, all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rules or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before him, all things, and in him all things hold together. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile all things to himself by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Jesus is the maker and the sustainer of our universe. But do you notice in that final sentence, he's not just the maker and the sustainer, but he's also the fixer of our universe. He reconciles all things in our scientific world to himself by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. And this peace involves peace between humans, but much more fundamentally, much more importantly, this peace involves fixing up our relationship to God. And so that's why when we read the story of the miracle in Luke chapter 5, we get so obsessed with the healing of the paraplegic man that we actually forget what Jesus' main point was, right at the top there. He says, "Friend, your sins are forgiven you." You see, according to Jesus, Jesus came to forgive our sins. And that is your biggest problem, and that is more miraculous than any scientific thing that Jesus could have done. Jesus says, yeah, sure, dealing with someone's paraplegia, that's a scientific difficulty. But actually dealing with someone's sin, dealing with your rebellion against God, is something that is much more profound and much more harder to do. But it is something that Jesus says he can do, and he does do by dying on the cross. So the question is, will you let him deal with your sin? For all those times you push God out of your life and try to live without him. Can I encourage you, we've asked the question today, is Jesus compatible with science? But I want to ask you the bigger question is, are you compatible with Jesus? Do you fit into his world and the world that he's going to make one day when he reconciles all things to himself and makes them how they're supposed to be? Can I encourage you today that if you want to explore this further, there's a number of ways you can do that. The first way you can do that is by coming along to further festival opportunities. Okay, we're going to have some more science-based ones. There's going to be an opportunity to think about will technology save the world with a professor from MIT. That's happening on next Monday, 1 to 2 o'clock. And also another one is Jesus Descended from Apes, a panel discussion about evolution. Okay, come along to those things and ask questions, think more about this. But if you'd like to dig a little bit deeper, can I encourage you, we also have these copies of Luke's biography of Jesus' life. Luke is a scientist, he's a medical doctor, and he wrote by interviewing all the eyewitnesses to Jesus' life so that we could have certainty about the things we're being taught. So the best way you can do is grab a copy of that. If you write Luke's biography on your Connect card, then someone from the EU will get in touch, and we'd love to read that with you so you can make up your mind for yourself. So the question is, will you accept Jesus' offer of forgiveness?